This episode is brought to you by Atlassian. Atlassian makes the team collaboration software that powers enterprise businesses around the world, including over 80% of the Fortune 500. With Atlassian's AI-powered software like Jira, Confluence, and Loom, you'll have more time to do the work that matters. In fact, Atlassian customers experience a 25% reduction in project duration per year. Unleash the potential of your team at Atlassian.com. Atlassian.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Outward, Slate's podcast for all things queer, and the identity sense, of course, but also this time of year in that 19th century spooky little girl who lingers silently at the bottom of the garden in the evening mist sense. Like, how queer she is. I'm Brian Lauder, an editor at Slate.
Wow. I'm Jules Gill Peterson, and I am that girl. Or I was. I definitely know of that which you speak.
I'm Christina Cauterucci, a senior writer at Slate, and I feel like I identify more as like the disembodied voice in your wall.
Oh, I love that, Christina. That's great.
Thank you.
That's queer too.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd rather just not have a body at this point, I think.
Not having a body, yet also informative and kind of all-knowing. Love that omniscience for you.
All right. Well, we have a really important show for you all today. We're going to be talking about a major case that's before the Supreme Court this fall, United States versus Skrmetti, in which 3 families and a doctor from Tennessee are challenging that state's ban on gender-affirming care for minors, and by extension, the government's ability to limit such care for trans people across the board. Currently, the United States is on the side of the plaintiffs, though that could change depending on the election. The challenge is being made under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, and the decision is arguably the most consequential before the court this term, and without question, an existential one for trans people in this country. Arguments will likely take place in December, but currently the court is receiving amici, or friend of the court briefs, from both sides, and we're going to talk about one of those today. The brief was written by a consortium of historians and scholars, and it takes on Tennessee's core argument in defense of its ban, that gender-affirming care is experimental or untested, and moreover, that transgender youth are a recent phenomenon or some kind of internet-fueled fad. We can reveal from the outset here that neither of these claims is true.
Spoiler.
Spoiler. But we wanted to talk about precisely how untrue they are. And luckily, we have one of the authors of this brief in the house, our own amico, Jules Gill Peterson.
Is that how you conjugate that word? Or a singular amico?
I think it's a singular amico.
Yeah, that sounds right to me.
Well, damn Latin for not making it more pretty. I want to be an amica. Or an amica.
Yeah, we can make it whatever we want.
I don't know.
Amica Jules Gill Peterson. In addition to that, we'll have your usual updates to the gay agenda over in the Extra Special Plus feed. If you are not yet a friend of Slate, you can join at slate.com/outwardplus. All right, after a short break, we'll be back to talk about what it's like to teach a crash course in trans history to the nation's highest court, a group that may not currently comprise the most receptive students. Stay with us. Hey, Outward listeners. After a night with drinks, it can be tough to bounce back the next day. But with ZBiotics is a surefire way to wake up feeling fresh. ZBiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Pre-alcohol probiotic drink produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to take ZBiotics with your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Also, ZBiotics is continuing to invent probiotics that will help with everyday challenges of modern living. Go to zbiotics.com/outward to learn more and get 15% off your first order when you use code OUTWARD at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with a 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/outward and use the code OUTWARD at checkout for 50% off.
You know when you reach that age where everyone and their mother won't shut up about their credit scores, yet it seems like no one really understands what's so special about those 3 random numbers? That's because credit scores are meaningless, unless you have Credit Karma to show you how to use them. We use those 3 random numbers plus your financial profile to help you find your next opportunity. Like a more rewarding credit card, a game plan that helps you pay down debt faster, or a personal loan to help you save more on interest payments each month. Cha-ching! Download Intuit Credit Karma today to get started.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes per detail.
All right, we are back. Jules, you are in the hot seat today. As you have been before, I thought we might start just very generally with what's the goal of an amicus brief, and then what, from your perspective, is sort of the mission of this one in particular.
So amicus briefs are a friend of the court brief. It's such a cute phrase. You get to be a little friend to the Supreme Court. But, basically this is this rarefied genre where different, relevant groups with expertise or interests in case get together, and with all of the professional trappings of, legal citations and all of that, basically get to provide something of their recommendation or expertise that is relevant to the case. So, these sorts of things, I think, kind of grow out of that way in which judges obviously at all levels are having to make decisions about things about which they know very, very little to nothing. And so the idea of the friend of the court brief is like, well, we know a lot about this. Let us synthesize our expertise and present it to you, having read whatever is at stake or at odds in this particular case. So in this case, basically, there are a whole bunch of different amicus briefs filed to the court, right? There are certainly ones from healthcare providers, right? There are ones from major medical associations. There are briefs written, on behalf of trans youth themselves, the people who more broadly are affected by these kinds of state laws. And this one is the historian's brief. And if that seems sort of stodgy, well, yes, of course. But I think people may also have the sense that these sorts of historians' briefs have become a lot more significant in recent years. They often do play important roles, and that has to do with the composition of the federal judiciary and the sort of appointment, by successive Republican administrations of more textualist, right? Not just like originalist, but especially textualist justices, people affiliated with the Federalist Society, for example, who tend to interpret the law based on the meaning of language and statutes at the time of their passage, or the meaning of words in the Constitution at the time of its ratification or of amendments, right? And so in that context, I think people might remember, for example, with the Dobbs decision, like one of the primary opening rationales of the majority opinion was that allegedly, according to the court, there's no long history of people getting abortions in the United States. And in fact, professional associations of historians had gotten together and submitted an amicus brief that demonstrated quite precisely that there is an extremely long history of abortion in the United States. Abortion is much older than the United States. Okay, but that just goes to show that I think actually being able to provide historical evidence has become a lot more important in recent years. And so the point of this brief, right, is certainly to contest the main claim in the circuit decision that's brought this Tennessee law all the way up to the Supreme Court, which does very explicitly make the claim that it's fine for the state to restrict or effectively ban gender-affirming care for minors because it's novel and untested and experimental, as in it doesn't have a long history. And so in swoops historians and we're able to, demonstrate, actually, that's just factually untrue. There's a quite long and rich history, both of medical transition in general, but specifically the history of trans kids. So some of the point of the brief is just to say, like, well, the facts of history don't accord with the reasoning, in the court system up to this point. Then more broadly, it is to offer a kind of evidence, that is concordant with our textualist judiciary. But I would say maybe one other thing that is really important to all of us who worked on this. It's a really public document. It is very much written in legalese to some extent. It has imposing font and margins. But that being said, this is a document that is on file with the Supreme Court of the United States, in which we make a broad historical case for the, importance and longevity of medical transition and youth transition. And one of the things we thought about was like, well, we want this because it's public and has that kind of credential stamped on it of the court, we want this to be a document that people can pick up and make use of, because trans history is pretty scarce, right? There are only, so many books out there, and a lot of them, including my own book about trans youth, not the most readable thing. Wrote it for an academic audience. So this might still not be the most readable, but there's a lot jammed in there that we're kind of hoping people might want to use, however it might benefit them in their own organizing or advocacy, or just like as a source on this history as well. So maybe that's the most silver lining purpose of this brief.
Yeah, I think of it also as itself kind of a historical document. Like decades from now, when people go back and say what the hell happened with that case? Or yay, remember that amazing Supreme Court decision? We'll see. But what were people thinking at the time? What were people talking about at the time? Did somebody make an argument about this specific thing? And this will always be there to show that yes, people were thinking about this. This is the argument that they made. And there's so much. I mean, you say that it's a public document that's more accessible. And even though, as you say, it is full of these very weirdly obtrusive citations in the way that Supreme Court documents necessitate, it's short enough and written in plain enough English that it is very understandable. And I mean, it's just full of incredible history, including from ancient history about medical transition. And in most cases, I think we would not be necessarily swayed or impressed by the idea that a certain medical practice was happening hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago or even 50 years ago, because the thing that matters is recent and up-to-date medical knowledge.
Right.
I was actually going to use leeches as an example. We're not, but then I Googled it, and sure enough, they still do use leeches in some situations.
Yeah, I was going to say that's back.
But what is it about gender-affirming care that, the fact that it was happening thousands of years ago doesn't make us think that it's a discredited or seemingly kind of barbaric or primitive thing like we think about a lot of ancient medical practices? But what is it that makes people feel, or what might make people feel confident or soothed by reading about the same kinds of procedures or treatments happening decades or centuries ago?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because part of what we're not saying is the trans people that today, we have always existed exactly the same form, nothing has ever changed. That's not true of anyone, men and women, right? Things are culturally specific.
Right.
Massive historical change has completely, transformed different human societies across the centuries. So the more narrow argument of the brief is that the modern kind of medical transition rubric that we have today, and the specific medical interventions at odds in this case, are as old as modern medicine. So trans medicine just sort of in the West emerges at the same time as the rest of modern medicine, especially in the 19th century, kind of biomedicine, kind of medicine that is still practiced today. That's great. That makes sense. But there's something so interesting about the fact that especially surgeries have this incredible long history. And there's something a little kind of mind stretching about it. And I think, it was really interesting as we were working on this part of the brief and just sort of thinking about how to explain the significance of that, right? It was sort of right, it's we have all this modern verbiage and language and concepts, the ones that are at odds in this case, gender dysphoria, a diagnosable feeling, right? The response to which is medical transition, which, alleviates the gender dysphoria. Sure, that's how we put it today. It would be sort of on its face untrue to imagine that someone in 16th century peasant society in Western Europe or early modern China or pre-Columbian indigenous societies in South America had gender dysphoria, which they alleviated with medical. Of course not, because no one was, thinking of anything that way. And yet, it seems very obvious that people have had the desire to physically change their sexed bodies in many, many, many different human societies stretching back thousands of years. And in fact, some of the most long-lasting surgical practices in human history are effectively gender-affirming. They are, things like changing the shape of the chest, right? Changing the genitals, right? Orchiectomy style things. There are just this real longevity to the desire. And even though that desire was always articulated in a culturally competent, historically specific way to the time and place where people live, it's quite remarkable to see that desire emerge over and over and over and over again. And I think what that allows us to say that's so helpful, especially in this moment, is like, hello, medicine did not invent trans people. And we do have to make clear about that because I think, one, depending on how much people know about what transition even is, it can be hard for people to figure out why that wouldn't be true, right? And there also just is so much misinformation that suggests that it is either, for example, doctors pushing transition somehow, because, that's totally a thing, or just really, right, that like there wouldn't be trans people in the world if there weren't hormones and surgery. And what going back this far allows us to remember is that actually that's really not true. Modern medicine arrives so late, and you just see this constant desire over the course of human history that finds the best expression it can, based on circumstances. But very often, amazingly, that involves like forms of ancient and pre-modern surgery. And I just think that's such it's a bit of a head scratcher, like on an existential or conceptual level, but it's just powerful evidence, right? That there's nothing particularly modern about the desire to change your sex, right? Or to live differently than whatever status you inherited at birth. That is just like a feature of human societies. What has changed is like the means through which people can realize that desire. And so today it is this thing we call gender-affirming care at this moment. But I think it really matters to be able to say that hardly started because, doctors or scientists created a technological possibility. No, they're really just furnishing the resources to people who have long, desired for something, that makes them feel, more at home in their own bodies.
And in fact, that desire was so consistent in so many different societies that many different societies, as a lot of us already know, had specific, categories of people that were specifically revered or thought of as holy. But yeah, certainly that generated from people having that desire to change, as you say, their sexed body, which is, I guess, the term that's most accurate when we talk about stuff in history. But the Amicus brief did not read like a legal document in that way. It read like a jaunt through history. I loved it.
Oh, I'm so glad.
All right, we should take a quick break. We'll be back with our Amica briefer extraordinaire, Jules Gill Peterson, in just a minute.
At Sierra, discover top workout gear at incredible prices, which might lead to another discovery. Your headphones haven't been connected this whole time. Awkward. Discover top brands at unexpectedly low prices. Sierra, let's get moving.
How do you feel great on vacation? Like really good? Easy. You go to Aruba. You'll spend your time relaxing on cool white sand beaches and floating in healing blue water. You'll immerse yourself in natural wonder and find your center on an island where things move at your speed. You won't just feel great, you'll feel relaxed, renewed, and ready for life. That's the Aruba effect. Plan your trip at Aruba.com.
We're back with Jules talking about the Amicus brief she contributed to in U.S. versus Skrmetti.
Speaking of the document, just because our listeners probably haven't had a chance to read it yet, maybe we should just zoom out for a second and sort of lay out how the document is organized. And I guess what I was sort of curious about is there a strategy, or was there a strategy to that as y'all in the consortium put this together? Because it felt like there was to me, but I'm curious how you thought about that. And just, again, for our listeners, what does it actually sort of look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as much as we're providing a broad historical overview and see ourselves as sort of, synthesizing the peer-reviewed empirical research in the field of history, we're also specifically, furnishing this information in the context of this specific case, U.S. versus Skrmetti, which is an equal protection case. And that's really, really important. This case it's actually quite different from, say, Dobbs. Dobbs was about due process, right? It has to do with rights enumerated under the Constitution. This one is just a simple discrimination case, right? The argument is very elegant. And basically, if courts functioned just basically purely on logical reason, you would think it would be a total slam dunk case. So the non-discrimination, equal protection claim goes very simply like, you can't take away a set of medical interventions for one group only based on their sex, right? Because if you only take these things away from trans youth based on their sex assigned at birth, well, that constitutes sex discrimination, which is famously very hard to justify under US law, right? And so because of that, though, we sort of wanted wanted to make clear that the specific arguments that, this is novel or experimental or untested or untrue by showing that sort of longer history of trans medicine. And then we specifically wanted to just address the specific kind of medical interventions that are at issue when it comes to young people, right? So we wanted to talk about, and we talk about them in their order, basically the order in which they came to be utilized in medical care. So actually, we start with surgery, even though surgery is not necessarily at odds that much in this case, but we start with surgery because it is actually the oldest thing, right? Trans people have been having surgery, as we just talked about, in some cases for thousands of years. Okay. But certainly, at least since the late 19th century. And then we wanted to talk about hormones, right? Trans people, it turns out, start, using hormones basically for the moment they're reliably synthesized. So do non-trans people. Everybody kind of gets in the game at the same time in the 1930s, right? And then there are puberty blockers, which are at issue in the case. And puberty blockers are the most recently, developed medication. They were sort of created in the 1970s, but kind of were FDA approved in the 80s, have been used continuously since then for a variety of things. But, I sort of gave a little bit of a longer history of how medicine has thought about puberty and actually other ways that doctors tried to intervene in puberty even before puberty blockers. And then we kind of wrap up basically talking about some of the ways that, access to medical transition for youth was already, something that not just that people were getting access to many, many, many decades ago, but that already bore obvious, wonderful outcomes at the time. And one thing I really wanted to make sure we kind of squeezed in, because otherwise this is all kind of medical history. And I think if people read it, they might be like, oh, well, it's not very critical about medicine. And it's that's true, because that's not that's at issue in the case. Any demands trans people might have on the future of medicine, right? All those things are not at issue. It's just a discrimination matter. So we kind of end talking about the way sub-trans youth in the past themselves already faced similar scrutiny and questions about, oh, aren't you too young? Isn't this just sort of a passing fad? And how they already refuted those ideas many, many decades ago. So basically, we just kind of wanted to move through the structure of what matters in the case, and then kind of just dial in and be really concrete about the histories that are relevant in each of those areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think, are you talking about the letters from trans adolescents that you include at the end of the quotes? That really stood out to me because I found those quotes really affecting. You write that in the 1960s and 70s, gender-affirming care was starting to get coverage in the press. And when practitioners were named in the press, they would get letters from trans adolescents asking for help. And you include some quotes from them. And I know this has been actually a big feature of your work, is bringing the stories of trans youth from the past to life. I just want to read a couple of them because I found them so affecting. There was a 17-year-old trans girl from 1969, and she was saying that she was experiencing acute distress associated with puberty. And she wrote, "I understand that growth can be stopped with hormones." She was distressed by her, growing taller. "In that case, my treatment and growth can be controlled simultaneously. This can only be done if I start now." There's this sense of urgency that she deeply innately understands because of this is her experience. I feel like as a public intellectual, this has sort of been the cornerstone of your work to help us understand that these young people knew who they were, knew what they needed, even with hardly any public information to help them get there. I mean, what do you feel like the purpose of these voices serves in this brief that, as we described, is easy to read and fun, but is not necessarily a document of emotion?
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I'm just endlessly impressed by this treasure trove of young people that I've found in the course of my research, and the fact that they totally affected me. It was a real turning point in the book that I ended up writing, and so I've just sort of felt kind of attached to that ever since, and have felt and have experienced as well, and just sharing these kinds of letters, how much of an impact they have on people. And part of that, I think, is because when it comes to trans youth, the youth are sort of usually nominally absent from conversations about them. And for political struggle, it's usually a battle between different groups of adults, all of whom, because of the way we understand adult authority over young people, we're all sort of certain that our positions might be right, but that ultimately it's about adults making decisions for young people, not young people getting to do what they want, and not, maybe we embrace what they want, but it's only because of our good adult judgment. And I think there's something so important in a document that otherwise is very much about expertise. I mean, these are just the cold, hard facts. And I love that about history. I always happy to defend history as an empirical discipline, right? We don't editorialize. We don't go looking for what we hope the past was. We sit down and do the long, meticulous work of finding out what's in archives. And then we have to figure out what the significance of that is. But to really see these like teenagers, right, that particular girl, I mean, it's incredible. She has an extremely sophisticated knowledge of endocrinology, even by the standards of 1969. She understands that puberty is the moment in which her body is going to change so dramatically that if she's able to begin hormones and basically adjust the hormonal composition of her body, that's going to really dramatically affect her transition outcomes. And so in that sense, being told to wait until she's an adult to transition is unacceptable. It is painful. It is damn near torture, right? And she knows that. So she could write to a doctor and express that. I think there's something just really like arresting about that for adults. It just kind of checks us, right? It kind of just gets up and ruffles your feathers a little bit. It's like, oh gosh. And then I think the other thing about it for me is like, this was in 1969, okay? Like, yes, there were newspaper articles about trans people back then, but there was not a political movement dedicated to their endangerment. There were no state laws being passed concerning medical. There were no laws really at all specifically directed at trans people. There were laws trans people were affected by, but there was no, moral panic. There was no internet. There was no peer influence. There was nothing really, right? None of the trappings of the political context in which we live today. And yet the kinds of talking points that trans youth had to defend themselves against are almost exactly the same as the ones today. So that should really cue us in to there's nothing really interesting or novel going on today. And two, they already had all the answers back then and they could go toe to toe. And I just think that for me, it is really hard not to lose sight of what is at stake in these kinds of cases. They're very abstract. They're about medical regulation and protocol. They're about, state jurisdiction. They're about all of these kinds of abstract questions. But at the end of the day, they're about children's lives, their quality of life, and also about the basic kind of agency we do or do not accord to young people to steer the ship of their own lives, and the sort of abstractions that we use to justify when we think someone is allowed to be responsible for their own body and when they're not, right? And these are very live political matters in our country, but I think it just does something to stop and hear from a young person, 60 years ago and go, oh, okay, maybe the story we've been sold of this political crisis or this struggle, this moral panic isn't really, the whole truth. And maybe we actually already had all the answers a long time ago.
Well, because these quotes, and there's another one in there too, come in one of the last paragraphs of the brief, after you've made this ironclad argument that gives one the feeling of being like, well, yes, this is the prudent decision to make. The desire to transition and even these medical practices, like you said, they really developed alongside other types of medicine. Nothing about it is new or related to any sort of, social progress at all. And so you come to it at the end being like, as an adult and as somebody, if I were tasked with making the decision, I think I would make the right one. And then at the very end, you come back with this thing that reminds us that actually at the very center of this case is just thousands of children who are suffering right now. And there's something very simple to do that can alleviate that suffering. It's really sobering. And I know there were a bunch of people who contributed to this document, but I felt Jules really come through right there.
Well, it's a labor of love, errand of the heart kind of thing. But I think it matters, right? It's one of the larger points we just wanted to make is, whatever you might think, whatever anyone thinks about medical transition is kind of irrelevant. It really doesn't matter. We don't ban forms of medical care except for abortion and contraception, reproductive health, just based on, people's moral condemnation of them. But if that's really the door you want to open, you have to think about the implications for everyone. And the fact actually is that young people transition and medical transition is older than open heart surgery. It's older than most organ transplants. It's older than Tylenol. So what? What are we going to do? It's been around for at least 100 years. Is that really a good enough reason to ban it? And the answer just surely is no. But why it's so cruel and degrading to do so, goes way beyond just that. I think it really is the human factor here.
Yeah. Christina just mentioned that there are a bunch of people who contributed to this. And I was actually curious what collaboration looked like on a document like this, and if there were any interesting or spicy like debates that came up, or were you all very much in alignment about what to say and it was very easy? It's such a clearly written, and sort of direct piece of writing that it's hard to imagine that. But I know that there must have been quite a lot of people in that Google Doc at the same time, so to speak. So yeah, what was the collaboration process like?
Yeah, it was really exciting, actually. The field of trans history has been around definitely for a number of decades, but it is in a moment of efflorescence. But that being said, for a variety of reasons, the main one, which is historically, trans people, particularly trans women, have not had material access to professional jobs. There have been very few trans people as professional historians, right? And so this is a document of professional credentialed historians, and so it's a small pool. And so in that sense, it was interesting because we could take stock of a pretty large literature in which there are some debates overall, I would say, but, not a ton. I think the question for us was more about public history and a question about strategy. How do you present, the nitty-gritty, and how do you synthesize such vast, fields of knowledge in a way that is sort of understandable and usable and actionable, right? And so I think that was those were kind of the bigger questions we had. Like, how do we make clear things that otherwise are pretty rarefied academic questions and usually don't matter? Right. So like a big one was the thing to which that sort of long history of surgery replied initially. How do we help people understand that, it's not the kind of like wish fulfillment of historians to claim that trans people, as in medically transitioning people, have existed throughout human history. That couldn't possibly be true because modern medicine didn't exist throughout human history. But that doesn't mean that trans people don't have a history, and that doesn't mean they don't have a longevity. That's actually a tricky question, right? And I know for me, that's a question I've worked out not so much only in writing, but in teaching. And so that was often, I think a lot of our collaborations as historians were kind of like hashing out through our own teaching experience. Like, how do we tend to make those claims, right?
Like, how best do you express this to a bunch of people seeking to learn from you?
Exactly. Yeah. It's like pedagogy, right? Yeah. And I think then the other thing was, just sort of how do you constellate all of the different moving parts, right? This is the U.S. Supreme Court. We need to give a mostly U.S. history. But when it comes to the history of trans medicine, Germany in particular has like a really important role to play. Right. In the late 19th and early 20th century, certainly in the Weimar Republic, certainly Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, the Institute for Sex Research, which was famously sacked by the Nazis in the 1930s. Okay, how do we tell that story without kind of getting away from the U.S., right? Because certainly for this court, what happened in U.S. history is what's most important. Like the U.S. today is very globally influential in the field of trans medicine, but, for the first half of the 20th century wasn't necessarily as globally influential. So how do we manage that? And I think the other big thing we really wanted to think about is sort of how do we differentiate between the history of trans adults and trans youth, because obviously this is a case about youth first and foremost. And every morning I wake up and thank the goddess that I decided to write a book about the history of trans youth, because unfortunately there would have been none otherwise to turn to. But that doesn't mean it would, right? Like, we have to also talk about a broader history of medicine, and we need to talk about things that involve adults. So those were kinds of the nitty gritty. But I have to say, scholarly labor is often something you do in isolation. It was actually just really interesting to sit down and kind of like brain trust with a lot of other people in my field who I trust and respect and whose work I love, and really just kind of work through this. And then the triangulation of it was really fun because we had a law professor who was guiding us, right, in the genre of the Amicus brief, which was new to us. And so kind of taking it from that moment of like, okay, we've been really like out in the weeds of the archives of the peer-reviewed scholarship. Oh, right, now it's got to make sense to law clerks and to the Solicitor General of the United States. Well, we don't know her. So can you that was a really fascinating process, and it had to be collaborative, right? I think that's one thing that was so exciting. And one of the things I'm most proud of about this brief on that note is that both of the major professional associations of historians in the United States, the Organization of American Historians and the American Historical Association, have signed this brief. And that it's like, okay, whatever historians are among our listeners are like hooting and hollering right now. But like the significance of that is really big. It means that U.S. historians as a profession, their two big associations signed on behalf of their membership. They reviewed the brief in great detail. They evaluated it at the level of scholarly rigor and content, and they debated it amongst themselves to make sure they were comfortable with it. We sought their feedback, and now it represents the view of all American historians, like the profession, right? And that to me is so important. So we're speaking with that kind of united voice. And so in that sense, right, it could only be this kind of collaborative effort, but it was kind of a big deal because trans history is a small corner of the profession of history. And so in some ways, I'm just so happy that all of my colleagues in this profession embrace the work that me and my colleagues have been doing and have, actually added their collective voice to it. I think that's really, really important, especially to say that directly to the court.
Okay. I mean, I know as we talked about at the beginning of this chat, there are a lot of reasons why you might want an amicus brief, a lot of things that you hope it would do. Given the current makeup of the Supreme Court, like, how do you imagine this affecting the outcome of this case? Or in your wildest dreams, like, what do you hope will happen now?
I mean, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm a historian. I'm by nature a backward-looking person. But I will say, I'm also not a lawyer, right? And in getting to speak with lawyers and some of the people involved peripherally or more directly with this case, I mean, in terms of legal reasoning, it is a slam dunk case. Like, it is so easy, right? You just can't say, I'm sorry, your sex assigned at birth was male and you want to take estrogen to transition. So you can't do that. But if you were assigned female at birth and you want to take estrogen for, similar reason, totally fine. Hello, that's sex discrimination. So it should be so easy, right? And the historical record is so unambiguous. Like I said, these medical interventions are much older than so many that are routinely used today. And their age is really just like no reasonable like pretense for banning them. It just doesn't make any sense, right? So in that sense, I would hope that this brief kind of just, again, provides really boring, cold, calculated, reasonable, empirical, irrefutable evidence that the central claim, by Tennessee is at the Sixth Circuit is just factually untrue and therefore can't stand. I don't know what will happen, right? But, to me, I think one thing that's really important about being able to make this argument directly is to make it, again, to everyone, for it to be available as a statement that, I don't think most people know this history. How could they? I think that's part of the reason why we're in this situation in the first place. And so I'm glad that whatever happens, that we made our case, made it as best as we could with the incredible kind of evidence that we have. And ultimately, I guess, I hope that it's a reminder that even though this is a form of expertise, yet again, trans people apparently need experts to prove that we deserve basic things that everyone else gets to have. I just hope that it feels helpful to have a kind of expertise, even though it's about medicine, that's not coming from doctors and psychologists, because at the end of the day, I think one of the larger questions we have to deal with in the aftermath of whatever this decision is that the fundamental wrong and vulnerability that trans people endure is because it's actually wrong to give all the decision-making power to doctors in the first place to decide what people get to do with their own bodies. That's what created the very vulnerability that's being exploited by these state laws. And I just hope that the role that history plays, which is kind of where that brief ends, where you just remind yourself that no, actually, like, trans people, ought to be the architects of their own destinies. There's just really no way around that. I hope that this is sort of a moment, again, to think of history as one of the ways to push us, to help us sort of stretch and break out of the really limiting mindset I think we've inherited from the idea that, like, well, maybe medical transition is okay as long as someone is in charge of making sure it doesn't happen too much, or doesn't happen in the wrong way, or doesn't shake things up too much, or doesn't cost too much, or doesn't disrupt people's families. And it's like, no, I don't think that's really what history or the present tell us, but it's really hard to get there. And so I hope we win this case. I hope it's a wonderful kind of break from the escalation of recent years. I hope we're getting to celebrate it on a future episode of this podcast. But no matter what happens, I hope that it provides at least some resolve to people to understand that we're not walking into this moment, with without all of the accumulated force and strength and confidence of the people who came before us, we are not left with nothing to find our way in this moment and find a future, no matter what the court might say.
I think that is a lovely place to end it for now. Listeners, we will be tracking this case certainly throughout the fall and whenever it's finally heard. It's U.S. versus Skrmetti. And like Jules said, this is a public document. It is available. We will post it on our show page. But you can also just Google it, I'm sure. Yeah, we'll put that PDF on the show page. Please read it because it's really a powerful thing to read. And, Jules, thank you for
thank you,
your
Jules.
part in writing it. It's really something.
Oh my gosh.
And hopefully it does everything that you want it to do and more.
Well, thank you for letting me blab on about it for a little while. I appreciate it.
All right. I think that is it for this week. As always, you can send us feedback, topic ideas, or anything else to outwardpodcast@slate.com. Our show was produced by Pala Shaw, a friend of podcast listeners everywhere. If you like Outward, please subscribe in your podcast app, tell your friends about it, and rate and review the show so others can find it. And just a reminder that by joining Slate Plus, you'll get ad-free podcasts, extra segments across all of our podcasts, and you'll never hit a paywall on the Slate site. And you can listen to Pride and Provocations and special editions of The Gay Agenda. To learn more about that, go over to slate.com/outwardplus. Until next time, so long, my amici.
Stay gay.
Stay gay, Latin style.
Hey everyone, this is Mary Harris, host of Slate's What Next podcast. 30 years back, Lyle and Eric Menendez were sentenced to life in prison for murdering their parents. But in the last few weeks, a miniseries, a documentary, and most importantly, a legal argument have brought their case back into the spotlight.
The defense made the argument of they were victims of sexual abuse. And while that might not be a perfect reason to kill your parents when they're not currently in the act of sexually abusing you, they subjectively believe that they were in hell their entire lives.
So, are two of America's most notorious killers about to go free? Check out What Next for the rest of the story, wherever you get your podcasts.